Hi, it's Thomas D here, broadcast journalist for Gasworld. I've been joined by our global content director, Rob Cockerill. Rob, you uploaded a column yesterday, a big day for the UK in its race to net zero, or was it?
That's a very good question, actually, Tom. That's a good way of positioning it. Yes. So I left the day to reflect. I saw the reaction coming in, tried to get my head around this revitalised net zero plan. My overwhelming feeling was not that revitalised, and there's not much to it. I think, as I wrote in my column, there's no teeth to it. There's no kind of, it feels like it lacks ambition, and in some places lacks common sense, in my view.
So is this a lack of foresight from the government, or is it the whole industry in one?
I'm not so sure it's on the industry side. I think we could probably all acknowledge that the industry is doing everything it can. I mean, sure, can always do more, but I think what we certainly hear across our gasworld and HGV brands is industry is waiting for the right policy environment. And then when you've got the right policy environment, you have the funding and the investment, and it all starts to flow. For me, this is a very limited policy environment in the UK still, after all these years, and I might say false dawns.
So going into it, did you expect more, or were you almost expecting this from the UK government?
Personally, and perhaps cynically, I don't know if I did expect more. You're hopeful, and I think a lot of people were hopeful of a grand plan being unveiled, and there are some very good elements to this net zero plan. We have to acknowledge that. As I said in my column, we also have to acknowledge that we have to be pragmatic. I've said it many times before, as much as we're the big fans of green hydrogen and the technologies our industry is putting forward, you can't just uproot the fossil fuel-based economic tree overnight. You simply can't do it. It's not pragmatic and it's not economic. So I do have a degree of kind of empathy with the government and the plan, but it just doesn't go far enough.
And the CCS developments from this announcement?
Yeah, very good point there in itself, Tom. You said CCS. What we want to see is CCUS. It's that utilisation part. I think I said in the column, it feels like there's a sense of false economy on the whole with this plan. If you're at a halfway house and not fully getting behind these clean technologies, clean tech attracts big investments. It attracts big stakeholders from around the world. You become an attractive environment for people to invest. From that comes jobs, of course, and a much healthier economy as a whole. It's the kind of fundamentals of an economy. And yet we feel it seems like we're holding back there. So that is a false economy in itself. You've got to invest now and create that environment for the long-term benefits. Where I think there's also a false economy is around this whole carbon capture and storage emphasis. It feels as though we're really lacking on the utilisation side of that. There are CCUS elements to the plan, and they've got to be lauded, but it doesn't feel like it goes far enough. And what I can't seem to get my head around is why we would be wasting that CO2 resource. I mean, 2018, we had the great CO2 shortages in the UK and Europe, when suddenly the public and government and everybody switched on to CO2 and its uses because they couldn't get a pint in the pub, and we were told that crumpet production lines might be slowing down or were on the bread line. Despite these market crunches and these huge sectors that rely on CO2, we don't seem to be helping the supply chain. I mean, September 2021, we saw those CO2 shortages. The government reportedly spent tens of millions on propping up the CF Industries plant in Billingham temporarily to keep the CO2 flowing. How many times are we going to do that? Again, is this a false economy? Shouldn't we be taking the CO2 we capture and instead of sticking it in the seabed or in the ground, why aren't we utilising that? We could be utilising it, putting it back into the supply chain, and I'm not saying we'd fully avoid the shortages, but we could help to alleviate them. We could make a more diverse supply chain. That just seems like much more common sense to me.
So are you saying we're setting ourselves up for almost future shortages?
I think to a degree, yes. As I said, I don't think we can fully avoid them. The industry has its own work cut out to do that. But the industry, I mean, we heard in Austria just a few weeks ago at our CO2 summit, the industry sees the storage side of CCS as a threat almost. It's a wasted resource right there. CO2 is one of the top 5 industrial gases used across a range of sectors, not least food and beverages, of course. And yet we would be just putting that into the ground. It just seems hugely counterproductive, and that's certainly the way the industry seems to feel as well.
Interesting you mentioned our Austria summit there. I'm sure we can dig out some of the audio from that summit where we were discussing this almost threat.
Absolutely, yeah.
So let's take a listen to that.
What I see happening going forward is that carbon capture and sequestration will take many of those large pure sources underground. It's an easy solution for them. It helps them with their carbon footprint, and it takes away that carbon liability. And so that means that we're going to lose those sources over time, or some of those sources over time.
Another threat to the carbon dioxide supply chain is the artificial value chain reaction of carbon capture and storage, which is driven by political decisions and will be heavily subsidized. The higher the value is given to sequestering CO2, the more likely it is that industrial CO2 might be reallocated to sequester sites rather than industrial uses. The USA already agreed to $75 per ton sequestered. In Europe, several carbon trading schemes have seen prices for future sequestered CO2 for over £500 per ton.
Carbon capture and sequestration will compete for CO2 that's now supplying our market. So we're now competing with them, and we're going to lose on some of those big sources. New sources and technologies are essential to support our growing demand, and they're not ready today. We're not there yet, so we still have some work to do.
Well, there we go. They pretty much echoing what you've just said there.
Yeah, or perhaps it's just me echoing them. You know, we're here to give a voice for these issues, of course, but I just think we need greater emphasis on the U in CCUS.
Reading the column, you say the UK we're what you call a halfway house. Explain this a bit.
Yeah, it just feels like we're stuck in the UK. We're not sure how to proceed. Should we go full bore behind hydrogen? Should we get behind other fuels? What is the best lever for decarbonisation? It just feels like we're not putting all our eggs in one basket. It doesn't feel like we're actually filling any of the baskets. We're just stuck in this indecision, is what it feels like. And that's how it appears in terms of the funding. I think 240 million was the magic number for the net zero hydrogen fund. Fantastic, big number, but it pales in comparison to the investment sums we're seeing across Europe and the US, for example, and no doubt other regions. I mean, look at Europe, where they've got the projects of special interest. They've got billions going into these funds, not 200 million. So if you really believe in that net zero hydrogen fund, surely you'd be putting more behind it.
Yeah, certainly seems a small figure to me. You round off the column by asking to spare a thought for biogas and biomethane. Do you want to expand on that a bit?
Yeah, I mean, I wrote in the column, it might feel a bit harsh, and when you say it on camera, it feels that way. But I said, I wondered for a number of years whether the biogas sector had a chip on its shoulder. It felt like it was always trying to shout to be heard. But actually, in hindsight, maybe there is an element of that, and there is a good case to be heard, I think, is the point. And yet it felt like it's been completely glossed over once again. You know, there's some very quick wins we could make in biogas, biomethane, and those kind of liquid fuels. And it doesn't feel like they're being fully acknowledged. So I have a degree of sympathy there. And again, it seems to lack common sense to me. We're not taking advantage of the quick wins, but it doesn't seem like we're particularly getting behind the long-term drivers either. So again, that's why I feel like we're in this halfway house. And I'm hearing from parts of the industry that it feels as though the government doesn't understand the opportunity, perhaps doesn't understand the science and the technology. And if you don't understand that, you're naturally not going to understand the opportunity in front of you.
Absolutely. Well, Rob, a great column and great to speak about it here today. Where can our viewers read this column in full?
Gasworld.com, you can find it right there.
Excellent. Take a look.